How you doing, guys? Welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. So today we're looking at this 2013 Toyota Sequoia. Now, usually when we look at cars that have 100,000 miles, 150,000 miles, oh, it's a Toyota, it's barely broken in. This one might be just over the break-in period a little bit. It does have some problems, which we're going to look at. We have overheating problems, we have no heat, and a potential head gasket issue, which I'm going to show you how to diagnose that and everything. But before we get started, I want to show you what I mean by this one might be a little bit past the break-in period. Let's head inside as we open the hood and we take a look at everything. Because this Sequoia has 291,854. The truck is actually in great shape inside and out, but we do have a flashing tire light there. But that's the least of our problems today, because we potentially have a head gasket problem here. And in this video, we're gonna take a look at the head gasket. I'll show you the simple ways to check a head gasket when it's this far gone. And then we'll talk about a few things specific to actually if you own a Prius. There's a little trick on how to check the head gasket when it only happens occasionally. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. If you are a returning subscriber, first, you're awesome. Second, thank you for tuning in for another video. And without further ado, let's dig right in. All right, so let's do our diagnosis. So here is the concern. This engine misfires, and we have low heat or no heat, and the temperature gauge occasionally creeps up and just rapidly comes down. Whenever you have a temperature gauge that goes up, goes down like very rapidly, that's usually not a good sign because you have air in the system. If you just did a coolant replacement and you have an air pocket, that could be normal. But if it just all of a sudden starts happening on its own, that's not a good sign, because where's that air coming from other than from the combustion? But there's a very simple test that you can do to cars like in this state where we already lost heat, we have misfiring, we have all kinds of issues. It's called a block test, and I know the name doesn't really correspond to what we're actually doing. All that test does is checks for combustion gases from the cylinder in the coolant. Most people associate a blown head gasket with, the milky oil and all this stuff. But actually, with Toyota at least, that's not always the case. This head gasket is completely blown in this car. But if we look at the oil here, it is perfectly fine. I don't see any milkiness. It's a little bit on the dirty side, but it's not milky. Yet, we do have combustion gases in the radiator, but they're not enough. You don't have liquid coolant going and mixing with the oil. You just have combustion gases here. Let's do the block test, and don't worry, this car never opened a radiator cap like that on a car with a head gasket, because you could have that giant explosion. This car has cooled down. We've already opened the radiator cap, so of course, there's almost no coolant here. This is a block tester, and the fluid that we have with it, this is basically just a dye. You see how it's blue in color? If you pass the combustion gases with this blue fluid, it turns yellow, and that's your telltale sign that you have exhaust gases in the radiator. And the only way that would happen is if your head gasket is leaking. So let's do this test real quick so you can see how you do this if you're doing this on your own. It has a fluid level right here. We're going to add some fluid here. There we go. We added the fluid. You see that it's blue in color, because I want you to watch the color of this, how it's going to change. This is just a pump to pull gases from the radiator into this. You're going to set it on the radiator, and let's see, the moment of truth. Now, I want you to see this. It's greenish yellow. It completely changed color. I really hope that you can see this very clearly on camera, how it changed color. This is the original fluid for reference. This is a blown head gasket. There's no question about it. There is no other place where exhaust gases would make their way into the radiator other than a blown head gasket. But we want to find a little bit more, because that's when most people go, okay, it's a head gasket, let's just start ripping into it. Well, that's a mistake, because first, this car has almost 300,000 miles. There is a very high chance when things are this advanced in the blown head gasket world that we have warped cylinder heads, warped block, and it gets to a point where this is beyond repair. Or if we want to repair it, now I gotta replace the cylinder head, replace all that. It just gets pointless. So we have to do a little bit more digging to see exactly how progressed is this issue. And to do that, let's check for codes, because this car have had a history of misfiring, and usually we want to find where did the head gasket blow. So let's hook up our scan tool and we'll see. So I connected my scan tool. The only code we have is a P1605. These codes are typically very generic and they just tell you a condition. Well, rough idling, I know the car's idling rough, the head gasket is blown. But unfortunately, this one is not cooperating with us, because usually with head gaskets, like especially I'll tell you this case on a Prius, you'll get it in, it'll have misfire number 2, misfire number 3. Well, usually on these, the head gasket will blow to the coolant jacket sometimes, and sometimes it'll blow between the two cylinders, where when the cylinder is compressing, it pushes air in the second one and causes an imbalance. But in this one, we don't have any. And I was looking at the freeze frame data. The freeze frame is like a black box data of, it just takes a picture of where everything is at in the data list, so you know what was happening at the time that the code set. So here's the freeze frame data, and what I'm looking for is cylinder misfires. And let me just find them and we'll show you, because we want to see which cylinder was misfiring when this happened, if any. Cylinder 1 misfire through cylinder 8. And it's not registering any misfires when this was happening. So this is gonna slightly complicate our diagnosis, because now we don't know which cylinder we're going after. So because we couldn't find any info, I actually rung up the owner of the car, because I know he's a DIY mechanic. He tries to do a few things on his own. The code that was happening all the time for him when it was misfiring is cylinder number 5. I'll put this little chart here, and this is actually a really good TSB that tells you which cylinder is where in the V6 and the V8, because they could be, you know, different, the V8 especially. Cylinder number 5 is the third one on the driver's side. So here's the plan. Let's take one spark plug out. Let's first take a peek inside the cylinder. Usually when you have a blown head gasket and you have coolant going into the cylinder, the telltale sign when you look at the piston will be abnormally clean, because coolant has water and it's almost like being steam cleaned, and you'll see the cylinder will be spotless, beautiful. It's been steam cleaned with a pressure washer. That's literally how this happens. And then I'll show you a little trick that we found through experience, that this really works well on Priuses that only have misfires in the morning, then it goes away. But I hope we are able to actually see it, but I'll explain it. Let me pop this coil out and the spark plug, and then we'll continue. Let's remove the spark plugs, and this is how, in case you own a Sequoia and you always wonder how do you reach the back, here's how this works. You climb over, and you are careful with the radiator there, and we're gonna try to pop the coil. It never really happens. There we go. Something that is notorious for these is to break the bolts when they get really old and rusty. Okay, well, here's our coil. Let me take out the spark plug. Okay, up we go again. Now this is what I call mechanics yoga. You know, mechanics don't work out. You'll never see a mechanic at a gym. because this is how we work out. This spark plug was extremely loose, and that's not a good sign. The only way spark plugs get really loose on their own, unless whoever installed them put them loose, is if they really get super heated and then they cool down and everything just moves around, and that's not a good sign. Let's see if it's an original. I hope it's not an original spark plug. We'll find out. If you have a Sequoia, this is how you work on it. This is the easiest. It's not the easiest on you. It's the easiest on to reach things. Okay. Okay, let's take a looky-loo. This doesn't look too bad, although I'm looking at the tip of it, and for this miles, this is a little too clean, suspiciously clean. It's not a factory installed plug. It seems like an original plug, iridium, but not a factory plug, so that's good. That means this was replaced at some point. Let's get our Borescope in there and let's see what we see. So let's take a looky-loo. And the first thing, I'll leave it here on the screen for you to see what I'm seeing. It's easier that way. This piston is suspiciously clean. And you guys have seen a few videos that I've done where we looked at pistons. I told you this is normal and good. This one is steam cleaned. I've seen more steam cleaned ones, but this one, you see that, like you see the color of the piston. The pistons are usually silver in color. I'll show you one. This is a brand new piston, silver color. Now look at this one. I see that silver. That rarely happens where you see it like that, except when they are, how should I say, steam cleaned by the coolant. But let's do this. Let's flip the camera on this Borescope, which is, in my opinion, one of the best Borescopes. I'm really loving this guy because it works really, really good. Let's flip it and look around. This is a head gasket. Oh man, this is so bad. Do you see the coolant right there? That is that reddish, pinkish. That's actually coolant on the head gasket, right there. I'll point at it in the video. That is coolant just pouring into the cylinder. And we're gonna leave it right at that point. And then we're gonna move on to our next step. You can actually see the coolant leaking inside the cylinder in case you don't have, I mean, this is too far gone, this is very clear, but sometimes you won't see that. So right now we're looking at where the cylinder head meets the block, where the head gasket is. If you pressure test it, you're actually going to see the coolant dripping. You'll see the lines. Now, though, I'll try to do this here. It might not happen because this car actually might be too low on coolant. There's no coolant to leak there. But let's try it. This is a coolant pressure tester. It's a very simple tool that just pressurizes the cooling system so you see if you have leaks, which in this case we know we do. But you can also use it to pressurize that part to see if the head gasket is leaking. And this is really beneficial if you own a Prius, like 2010, 2011, they're notorious for head gasket issues. If you have one of these cars, this is how you find the head gasket, because what these cars will do, they'll misfire in the morning only. You'll have like rattling and all kinds of noise, and then it'll clear up and everything is fine. It could be an EGR problem, but it could also be a head gasket. And this is the only way you will find out. You'll basically look in the cylinder, find the one that is steam cleaned, and then pressurize the system and look with the camera. You'll see drips literally coming down off the head gasket to the cylinder wall. Let's pressurize this guy at 15 psi. If it holds while we are looking here, let's leave it there and we'll take a look. I saw some bubbling earlier, but this might be just empty with coolant. It doesn't have any coolant anymore. But let's look around, maybe we'll see another spot bubbling. Yeah, there we go. You see the liquid coolant right there. Right there. You see it? It's about to form a drop. You see that? There's your coolant. I hope this is really clear on camera. You see the coolant piling up there, and it's about to start going into the cylinder. So imagine if I put 15 psi of pressure here, and we already have coolant going into the cylinder. Imagine when you have the compression, 200 psi plus, pushing that air. That air will just push the coolant back, go into the radiator stream and the cooling stream, and that is your classic blown head gasket. This is an extreme case. I mean, look how much coolant we have here. If you don't have it at this extreme point, like this one, this is like beyond done. But if you don't have it at this point, it'll actually be one drop that you'll see drop on the cylinder wall. And that's all. You won't see any more. You won't see it pulling up like that, like we saw in the video. You'll just see one single drop come down every once in a while. So you'll have to pressurize it, wait for a while, then go look with the camera, and you'll see just a tiny little trickle of coolant on the cylinder wall. So if you see that little drop, here's how that works. The leak is so small that there's not enough space for too much exhaust gases to go into the cooling system. So when you go do a block test, you're not gonna see it because it's such a minute amount. But when you look at it with a camera, you're actually going to see that tiny drop. And why these Priuses misfire when they're cold is you have some coolant sitting there that's going to throw things off. Until that coolant evaporates, you're going to get the misfire. Once it evaporates, runs perfectly fine. There's a very small trace amount of exhaust gases or combustion chamber gases, I might be calling it exhaust gases, that you know what I mean, in the coolant, but you're not going to be able to pick it up with a block tester. Every time you have a head gasket, you never just say, you know what, yeah, let's pull the cylinder heads off and put new head gaskets and we're good to go. That's not how this works, because Toyota engines, they're very well made. They're very high tolerance, even the old ones. We're not talking about new high-tech ones. Like this one, this is not new. They're very, very close tolerances. I mean, you need to check that cylinder head to be a perfectly flat surface. I mean, we're talking half the size of a hair variance, and we're no good, because these are metal head gaskets on these engines. You have to have a perfect surface on the block, perfect surface on the cylinder head for things to seal. And here's my dilemma with this car. And here is the conversation I will have with the owner. Okay, we tear into this engine, pull the heads off. The heads are warped. Well, most of these cylinder heads, you can't machine them because then it changes the timing because of the chain engine. So we put new heads on. And we only looked at one cylinder. It could be the other side as well. We're not going to risk it. We have to check it. I can't tell you exactly until we take it apart. But the worst part is, what if the block is warped? Then we're done. You need a new block. You can machine the block, but again, you risk the timing going out, because that's what happens with these engines. If you surface the cylinder head and the block, you could change the distance of the chain. If you take out too much, you can actually throw the timing off. And we've seen this. Shops that are not aware of this, they'll machine the block, they'll machine the cylinder head, and then next thing you know, the car comes in, runs perfect, but it has timing codes and it has lack of power. And then we dig into it, yeah, they're both machined enough where the timing is off. That's why these engines are high tolerance. They're very tight tolerance, and they're very precision made, where you can't, that's why they don't want you servicing these parts. You gotta be very careful with this, folks. The olden times are gone. This is the modern era, and I'm not talking like 2021 cars. I'm talking, this has been going on since we went away from the, cast iron blocks and all that. All these aluminum engines, they last forever, but eventually something's gonna give, and we're at this situation. You gotta be careful with these repairs. Going back to my conversation with this customer, the options are, we tear into this, we see what we need, and we go from there. Or you cut your losses, because now we know things are not looking great. This thing overheated, the chances of things are warped is very high. We get a used engine and put in this car. Low mile used engine in life is great. But then this is where the problems start, because If I get an engine that has 100,000 miles, beautiful engine, has maybe a 6-month warranty, whatnot, put it in this car and it'll run perfect and beautiful. But what about the rest of the car? It has 300,000 miles almost. What about the transmission? What about the differential? What about the suspension? What about everything else? It's working fine now. I drove this car briefly and the transmission shift's fine. But here's where mechanics get themselves in trouble. Put an engine, let's say we spend 4, 5, 6,000, depends how the prices of used engines are. And then 2 months later, the trans goes out. Well, this customer is not going to say, oh, well, what are you going to do? Let's spend another 3,000. No, they're going to say, I just spent 4, 5, 6, 7,000 on my car. What do you mean I need a transmission now? That's the problem. And this is where I like to inform people, look, if you want to go on this adventure, I'm a mechanic. I make my living off of fixing cars. I'll fix whatever you want as long as you have the check to support it. But I also have a conscience to tell them there's a point where you got to cut your losses and move on. Now, unfortunately for the Sequoia, if this was my car, I would move on because you're taking too much risks with everything else. Just move on. You already have 300,000 miles out of it. Move on, get yourself, if you really love the truck, get something with a lot less miles and life is great. Don't take the adventure off. Let's hold on to this one and it might end up being counterproductive. So that's, unfortunately, that is the case with trucks like these and engines when they get to this point. Now, why did this head gasket reach this point? It is really hard to tell because I asked the owner, they own this truck just when it had just under 200,000 miles, so they've drove it for 100,000 miles basically. You don't know how the previous owner did their maintenance, and you don't know what kind of shop was working on this. Did they use the right coolant? Did they do the maintenance right? Was the coolant when it was replaced blood right, or did we have air pockets that kept overheating the car and they never noticed? See, there's a lot of factors here. But at 300,000 miles, if I owned this car since it was new, and at 300,000 miles the engine goes, I wouldn't be upset. 300,000 miles, folks, is a lot of miles. And that's, you really need to know that. Always investigate. Always investigate. Don't rush when you do diagnosis. This is the biggest mistake that professional mechanics make, DIY mechanics, everybody. You always don't condemn things. Look and investigate and do your due diligence to get the full picture as much as possible. Because at this point, we know for a fact it is a very severe case. It is not just something small. We know that we looked at the cylinder, we potentially identified. In a real world scenario, I want to look at all 8 cylinders, see what we have. Is it one side, 2 sides, what's going on? Always spend the 90% of the job on the diagnosis side, not on the let's just tear things apart and replace parts. I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.